This is just a sample of the audiobook. To get the complete audiobook, access the link posted in the first comment.
A similar verbal delicacy would be employed 4 months later by Chinese leader Mao Zedong, when he ordered hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers into battle, deciding, for reasons somewhat parallel to Truman's, to call them volunteers. So, out of a question casually asked and rather casually answered, were policies and even wars defined. The terminology Truman offered that day in some ways endured. If it was an answer the President did not regret, many of the men whose duty it was to fight there did. Korea would not prove a great national war of unifying singular purpose, as World War II had been, nor would it, like Vietnam a generation later, divide and thus haunt the nation. It was simply a puzzling, gray, very distant conflict, a war that went on and on and on, seemingly without hope or resolution, about which most Americans, save the men who fought there and their immediate families, preferred to know as little as possible. Nearly 30 years after it was over, a phrase in a song by John Prine caught this spirit exactly. "We lost Davy in the Korean War, and I still don't know what for. Don't matter anymore." Over half a century later, the war still remained largely outside American political and cultural consciousness. The Forgotten War was the apt title of one of the best books on it. Korea was a war that sometimes seemed to have been orphaned by history. Many of the men who went to Korea harbored their own personal resentments over being sent there. Some had already served once during World War II, had been in the reserves, had been called away from their civilian jobs most reluctantly, and told to serve in a war overseas for the second time within 10 years, when all too many of their contemporaries had been called for neither. Others who had served in World War II and had decided to stay in the Army were embittered because of the pathetic state of U.S. forces when the North Koreans struck. Undermanned, poorly trained American units with faulty, often outmoded equipment and surprisingly poor high-level command leadership were an embarrassment. The drop-off between the strength of the Army they had known at the height of World War II, its sheer professionalism and muscularity, and the shabbiness of American forces as they existed at the beginning of the Korean War, was nothing less than shocking to these men. The more experienced they were, the more disheartened and appalled they also were by the conditions under which they had to fight. The worst aspect of the Korean War, wrote Lieutenant Colonel George Russell, a battalion commander with the 23rd Regiment of the 2nd Infantry Division, was Korea itself. For an army that was so dependent on its industrial production and the resulting military hardware, especially tanks, it was the worst kind of terrain. Countries like Spain and Switzerland had difficult mountain ranges, but these soon opened onto flat areas where industrially powerful nations might send their tanks. To Americanize, however, as Russell put it, in Korea, on the other side of every mountain was another mountain. If there was a color to Korea, Russell claimed, it came in all shades of brown. And if there was a campaign ribbon given out for service there, he added, all the GIs who fought there would have bet on the color being brown. Unlike Vietnam, the Korean War took place before television news came into its own, and the United States became a communication society. In the days of Korea, television news shows were short, bland, and of marginal influence, 15 minutes a night. Given the state of the technology, the footage from Korea, usually making it into the network newsrooms back in New York days late, rarely moved the nation. It was still largely a print war, reported in newspapers in black and white, and it remained black and white in the nation's consciousness. In the year 2004, while working on this book, I chanced into the Key West, Florida library. On its shelves were some 88 books on Vietnam, and only 4 on Korea, which more or less sums up the war's fate in American memory. Arden Rowley, a young engineer with the 2nd Infantry Division, who had spent 2.5 years as a POW in a Chinese prison camp, noted somewhat bitterly that from 2001 to 2002, each year marking a 50th anniversary of some major Korean battle, there were 3 major war movies made in America, Pearl Harbor, Wind Talkers, and We Were Soldiers, the first 2 about World War II, the third about Vietnam, and if you added Saving Private Ryan, produced in 1998, the total was 4. No film was made about Korea. The The best-known movie linked to Korea was 1962's The Manchurian Candidate, the story of an American POW who had been brainwashed in a Chinese prison camp and turned into a robotic